Oh, no,
and
no.
what the chances are of the Packers winning this year?
Oh, God, not good.
So we are live. This is episode 251 of the In the Tank podcast. We are talking about cancel culture. We'll probably talk a little bit about that episode that we did last week about Apocalypse Never. And maybe if we have time, we'll talk about ESG criteria on episode 251 of In the Tank podcast. As always, I am your host, Donald Kendal.
Hold on, wait a second, Donald.
That is Justin Haskins. He is editorial director.
I didn't know that there was an episode last week.
Oh, yeah, okay.
We had an episode without me.
Yeah,
I didn't even think you guys were allowed to do that.
It was our most viewed one.
Well, that's just because Jim and Jim's mom
also joining us. We have Isaac Orr, policy fellow at the Center of the American Experiment. How are you, good sir?
I just feel like Jim's mom's name is Ethel.
And reference, we have Squints from Sandlot, Jim Lakely. What's up, sir?
Hey, yeah. Hello. Yes, my mother's name is Anne, actually, and she is a big fan. So, hi, Mom.
Yeah, absolutely.
We did have a blue check mark, though. We had Schellenberger, and you missed out. So
yeah.
You know what? Actually, that makes perfect sense. You can only have one blue check on at a time.
That's right. This podcast it isn't big enough for two blue check marks.
Yeah. Good point. All right. I feel better now. All right. We're good.
Yeah.
Yes. So as I mentioned, that was by far our most viewed episode on YouTube. Blew our old record away, like more than double at this point. In fact, we were getting dangerously close to the 10,000 mark, which I had said apparently there's some record of this. But I said if we ever were to get an episode above 10,000, that would cut off my hair.
Really?
But we're a shade underneath. I think as the time of this recording, we're at like 9.5.
And I'd like to see how your hair would fare in a blizzard.
Well, you will, because I can't imagine that we're going to get an episode between now and the next blizzard that's more popular than the last one. Gentlemen, well, first, I guess I'll go to Justin. Did you actually watch the episode last week?
I didn't even know there was one. I told you.
Gosh, you're terrible.
No, I did not watch it.
And anyone that didn't check it out, like Justin, we interviewed Michael Schellenberger, who is author of the new book, Apocalypse Never, Why Climate Alarmism Hurts Us All. And it was a fantastic book, and it was a fantastic interview. So I would definitely encourage anyone that didn't check it out to go back and check it out. Isaac, you wanted to talk about this a little bit before we got into the other topics at hand. Because you're not finished with the book, right?
No, but it's very good. So the first 8 chapters are kind of boring for people as smart as us because we've been saying this stuff for years. But chapters, what is it, 10, 11, or 9, 10, and 11? Or is there a chapter? Whatever. The last 3 chapters are great, and it really just illuminates things that Schellenberger was an advisor to the Obama administration, and he found out that most of the grants for the green stimulus went to campaign donors, and he just got furious about it. So I think it's worth talking about that in its own separate episode someday. So yeah, I just think that we could do multiple episodes on that book. So I was a little surprised that we weren't going to do that this week, but I guess there's other things that we could talk about.
Well, obviously climate is a subject that we like to talk about a lot. Climate alarmism, global warming, all of that. And I also want to be able to bring him on again. And I'm sure he's still busy doing his, publicity book tour, talking about all this with bigger names than us lowly folks. So hopefully when all that cools down, we'll be able to have him on in the future and have another episode dedicated to this type of these subjects. So
yeah, we all need blue check marks, and then we can feel like we're peers with him.
Now you, Jim, you're probably the most active on Twitter out of all of us here.
It's not saying
Isaac.
Yeah, how many accounts do you have, Jim?
30.
Just the one. I mean, Heartland Institute has Heartland Inst. I have Jay Lakely. We also have some for our public policy newspapers like Healthcare News, which is HC Policy, and Budget and Tax News, which is Budget and Tax. And there's also one called the Freedom Pub for our blog.
And GR has one. Don't forget about that.
Which one?
GR.
Oh yes, Heartland GR, our government relations department has one too. So yeah, we have a family of Twitter handles. Sure.
So I brought that up to talk about how
good info. Yeah.
Familiar with Michael Schellenberger and his account and the kind of reaction that he got in like the week after his book was released. Did any of that stuff kind of stick out to you? I mean, I know that Isaac and Jim, and I, to a lesser extent, we're kind of jumping into his defense at some points, but it was kind of what we were talking about at the end of the last episode, that it seems like he might not be aware of the hornet's nest he's about to dive into.
See, like his responses to all these tweets make me think that he was aware. Like you and I kind of thought, well, this is going to go bad, but he's just rolling with it. I think he understood how, I think he knew he was throwing bombs, and he like got ready for that mentally, because he's been pretty ruthless on Twitter. Like he tore apart the Unity ticket or whatever the freaking Bernie folk and the Biden folk released today.
Right.
So yeah, I think that, you know, it's fun to see him fight back against people who we haven't liked for a really long time.
Jim, anything to add to
that? Yeah, I would just add that he, I was the one who mentioned that I don't think he really understands fully what he's getting himself into. And Twitter is a bad place to learn that you've ticked off a lot of people that used to be your friends. And I actually found it quite charming, to be honest, that he was trying. Michael Schellenberger was trying to use logic and facts and to have a reasoned discussion with these people that were flaming him. And he kept trying, and he kept trying, and he keeps trying, and it's to his credit that he does. But that's not what Twitter is about, and that's not what the climate alarmism movement is about. The climate alarmist movement is about shutting people like us up, and especially shutting people up like Michael Schellenberger, who used to be their ally and now is, you know, one of the worst people on earth right now to them and their mentality. So you know, I give him credit. He continues to try to make arguments and to steer people into thinking for themselves. But Twitter is a very, very poor avenue for that to happen.
Yeah, that's another reason why we should, you know, there's value in having him come on again in like a month. And just, Michael Schellenberg, you got to give us an update on, you know, what it was like the first month in like the climate denier pool. You know, how was that? And he's getting a crash course on it. He had a post recently talking about how Facebook is censoring his article that we were going to talk about, titled, "On Behalf of Environmentalists, I Apologize for the Climate Scare." So apparently on Facebook, and I went back and checked, and it must have been taken off, but apparently there was a warning that when you went to click on the article, it says that like what you're about to read is false. So it was like a type of censorship. He sent a letter, he composed a letter and sent it to Facebook saying that, you know, he thinks that was inappropriate. There was nothing in his thing that was false, and that they should remove that label on his article, which like I said, I checked, and I think they must have, but I don't know how long that was on there. But yeah, this is the kind of stuff that we at the Heartland Institute have, and you know, the Center of the American Experiment have had to deal with when we talk about climate change and the you know, renewable energy being terrible. So he's getting a firsthand account, and I would love to see his reaction to being, you know, neck deep in it for a month.
I just wonder if he has a Parler account yet, because, like, let's see.
Well, I know that you do, Isaac. Got like
he does.
20 plus followers. Oh, really?
Bam, just followed that guy.
Boom.
Boom.
Take that.
Yeah, take that.
Isaac, so you really want to talk about this? Is there any last bits before I move on to the topic at hand here?
No, that's fine.
All right. Well, my segue was going to be, I was going to give you one last chance to interject there, but that he was going to be canceled. But your shirt, is that a Brett Favre shirt?
Oh yeah.
Wasn't he canceled a long time ago?
Yeah, he was, Donald.
So yeah, your shirt is perfectly, you know, perfectly leads into our next.
I hate you. Right now, I hate you.
Cancel culture. Cancel culture. So this is
terms. He wasn't canceled.
Sure, whatever helps you sleep at night. So I've got a number of articles talking about cancel culture. There's actually been a number of, we've been wanting to talk about this for a few weeks now, and there's been some news about this that kind of makes it perfect for this week. But cancel culture, I want to have more of just an open conversation about this concept. I think it's something that, most of our viewers would be very familiar with. But in the conversations that I've had about this, it seems to be all over the place. It seems to be able to, it's almost talked about very generally, and that it can apply to a whole number of things. So I want to have a discussion about what is cancel culture. I think we need to define the term, talk about what levels of cancel culture are acceptable, which ones are crossing the line. And so that's kind of where I want to go with this. So cancel culture, obviously popularly, it's described as like, people said a joke 20 years ago, and then they're canceled. They're removed from whatever TV show that they're hosting. They're fired from their job. They're just like done. Society is done with them. So that seems to be like the leading idea of what cancel culture is. But then on Facebook, there was a friend of mine who's, pretty relatively conservative libertarian, who said that cancel culture stems all the way back to when like the Dixie Chicks said something bad about George Bush, and then conservatives didn't want to listen to their music anymore. So
it goes even further back, Donald.
Well, here, I'll open it up to you then, Isaac, because I really do want to try to define our term here. What is cancel culture?
Well, there was an example in the 1960s when a Mr. John Lennon said the Beatles were, quote, bigger than Jesus, and people all along the Bible Belt burned their Beatles records. So I don't think that there's anything new about this idea that we are like, we have our little tribe and we don't like to hear anything that doesn't comport with our own worldview. It just seems now that the repercussions for that are worse than a personal action of saying, oh, I don't agree with what John Lennon said, so I'm going to destroy my own property.
Sure.
Well, here's one difference. Here's one difference is that the Beatles were the biggest musical act in the world and probably still are. Cancel culture, they're coming after people who are otherwise anonymous, just regular people that work in an office or are a minor, low-level functionary in a city government somewhere, and that the cancel culture bullies descend upon this person who was anonymous literally yesterday and then has their entire life ruined. There's a reason why this goes back on Twitter, at least it goes back to a woman named Justine Sacco, I believe her name was. And it was, if you might remember that, there was a hashtag going called "Has Justine Landed Yet?" She made a joke of questionable taste. And by the time she landed in South Africa, her entire life was over. She was fired from her job. She was excoriated in the public square. And she had about like 200 followers at the time when she took off, and she just made a joke to her personal friends on Twitter, and her life was ruined. And then you can also it's worse now than it was before, because it targets relative, ordinary people, civilians, as it were, instead of celebrities like the Beatles, who were the biggest celebrities in the world. Just think about the Covington kids, the students from Covington Catholic High School in Kentucky. He was just standing there minding his own business. And then a left-wing American Indian activist starts banging a drum in his face. He smirks, and not just social media, but all of our mainstream media said about destroying a 16-year-old boy's life for nothing. That's what cancel culture is. Saying that John Lennon saying we're bigger than Jesus Christ is not quite the same.
Right. Well, I mean, like the idea of boycotts, that's like a very old concept, right? So, I mean, is that part of the continuum, would you say? Like, at what point does cancel culture start? Because like I could see somebody doing something legitimately horrible, and he is rightfully kind of fired, because of something that he, something horrible that he said. So like at what point does it become, cross the line from just being kind of like a boycott or a criticism, a healthy criticism, and cancel culture? Justin, do you want to chime in?
I have no idea. I don't know.
What a lazy answer.
Well, you know what, Isaac? You're like the king of lazy answers, first of all. And second of all, I honestly think it's very difficult to tell, right? Because this is part of the problem. When there was an abolitionist movement in England in the late 1700s, and into the early 1800s. And one of the ways that they protested slavery was to stop buying products that had been produced by slaves. Okay. And there was a big movement to, don't buy sugar anymore because sugar comes from plantations, and plantations, they're slavery, right? Nobody today would look at that and say, well, that's like cancel culture. That's a legitimate boycott of something that's like an evil act. The problem that we have today, though, is that the threshold for what is an evil act has become almost anything that's even slightly off of normal of what we consider modern standards, right? So Aunt Jemima becomes like intolerable evil that we ever had an Aunt Jemima as someone who is representing products. Like as soon as, and that's really, I think, the issue. It's not so much that we haven't always had this willingness to sort of cancel things or boycott products, or that's been around forever, as Isaac pointed out. I mean, this has been around for a really long time. I think, though, the difference is our threshold has become, we're so sensitive as a society now to anything that it's like we have to just cancel. And it's not just, and this is what Jim was alluding to, I think, it's not just, products and famous people and icons. It's now just anyone who's ever said anything bad ever in their whole lives, because everyone's being recorded all the time and they're putting stuff out into the world all the time through social media. We now have this long track record of people saying things that we never had before. I mean, when Jim was growing up, they didn't even have people, everyone that isn't, putting their thoughts out into the universe every single day, hundreds of times a day.
Yeah.
That just wasn't the world that they lived in back then.
Yeah, they just had to deal with papyrus.
Yeah,
it takes a long time for those to get spread around.
Exactly. You know how long it takes for papyrus to spread around a community? Long time.
Just making it is such a nightmare.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think that really is the difference. There's clearly a problem with cancel culture. We all recognize that, but figuring out exactly what is acceptable and what isn't acceptable, I think, is extremely difficult to do. And I think really what's at the core of all of this is how does modern society make that decision of what to cancel and what not to cancel? We don't. The media makes it for us. The people in media decide what is worthy of getting outraged over, and then they make people outraged by continuously covering it and telling us we should be outraged. And enough people get outraged, and all of a sudden there it is. Aunt Jemima is a great example. Aunt Jemima's been around forever, right? For a long, long time. Nobody even noticed or cared. And then all of a sudden, the media decided, you know what, Aunt Jemima, that's terrible. And they started running all these stories about Aunt Jemima. Now, all of a sudden, now all these people care about Aunt Jemima. Why? It's not like they didn't know what Aunt Jemima was. It wasn't like they woke up and it was like, oh my God, I've never heard of this before. Everyone had heard of it. So why were people all of a sudden outraged? Because the media made that outrage. They created it. And the media can do this anytime it wants, over anything it wants. And that, I think, is really the danger.
I don't think that was a lazy answer, Isaac. I mean, he was pulling facts from the 1800s on you there.
Yeah, that was good. I will definitely concede that I was wrong in that instance. But okay, so
I think we should cancel Isaac.
Agreed. That would free up a lot of time for me. I'm okay with that. But the people keep saying, "Hey, we need more Isaac on the show," so that's why I'm here for the fans. But okay, so let's get into this. Is a personal boycott, is that cancel culture? Or what is the definition that we want to talk about in cancel culture? Is it actively seeking for somebody else to punish someone else, right? Like, are we looking for somebody to get fired? Are we calling for their show to get canceled or their product to get canceled? And if you call for a boycott, is that the same thing?
So I think at baseline, it has to be, it can't be you as an individual just choosing not to purchase a product or something. I think where at bare minimum, it has to be you encouraging other people to also do that thing. That has to be, I think, the floor. Now, from there, I don't know exactly when you cross over into that line, but I think that's bare minimum. So if I just say, you know what, I'm not buying this product anymore because I don't like what these people believe, that's not cancel culture. That's just me making a personal decision. But if I start protesting out in front of, Chick-fil-A because I don't like what Chick-fil-A is doing, giving money to some charity or something, and I don't like that, then that becomes cancel culture, I think, at some point. Where, I don't know, but I think that at bare minimum it has to be.
Okay, well, let's do this. Let's walk it step by step.
Yeah.
Let's walk it step by step here. So Jim, during a meeting the other day, said that we shouldn't use DoorDash, right? Was it DoorDash? Because of something they said
No, it was Grubhub.
Don't use Grubhub, because the president, sent that memo out to all of his employees saying anybody who likes Trump or supported Trump has no place in this company. So, all right, they have no place in my choices, and there's lots of choices for having my food delivered.
So, is him encouraging people that were in that meeting? Is that cancel culture then?
No.
Or at least we're getting closer to it.
We're not. I don't think. See, I think you're getting. Yeah, we're taking a very slow walk, and that's fine on this topic.
I think
look,
that's
bring us closer to the line. Look, I want to know where the line is.
The definition of cancel culture kicks in when you urge Twitter to ban somebody's account, to kick them off the account. Cancel culture is invoked and properly defined when you encourage at the employee. Like, for instance, let's say Justin did something that on Twitter that annoyed the left. Oh my gosh, I can't believe that would ever happen. But if it did happen, somebody on the left would at Heartland Inst saying that Justin T. Haskins, blue check mark, should be fired from Heartland because he expressed this view that I think is bad, and that is cancel culture, and that's what's happening. People are getting fired. People are going to have to publicly humiliate themselves and apologize on Twitter and other public forums, or else they will be fired. That's what cancel culture is. And mostly it's apologizing just for having a view that the left doesn't appear to like at this very moment. There was a tweet by a woman named Philippa Sue that I saw this morning. Never heard of her before, but she has 475,000 followers. So she's pretty popular on Twitter. She says this: cancel culture, : if you are canceled but do not wish to be, you must work to earn back people's respect by owning up to the thing that canceled you in the first place, listening to others, educating yourself, and advocating on behalf of the people that you have offended / harmed. We have come to a point in this world where if you say something that I don't like or that I find offensive, I am now harmed. You have done, basically speech is violence. You have harmed me in some way because you have upset me, and thus you must be canceled. And the way to get out of being canceled is to basically prostrate yourself in front of the left and then advocate for the thing that you were criticizing. It's not this is like mind control. This is why it's not necessarily a big leap and exaggeration to say that we're going through an American version of the Maoist Cultural Revolution in China in the 1960s. People are wanting people to be publicly humiliated for saying things that the left doesn't like. That's where we are now, and that's what really cancel culture is. It's not me saying don't use Grubhub, use DoorDash or Uber Eats instead. It's this desire, this public flogging of people and trying to ruin their lives, get them fired. This person shouldn't be anywhere that I can see them. That's cancel culture.
So it's only when you, so before first we say, okay, it's not just an individual making a choice. All right. And now I think what Jim is saying is it's not just an individual telling the people immediately around him, his friends, coworkers, whatever, that he doesn't think we should do X, Y, and Z personally. It's more of it's a public thing. That's when it becomes cancel culture. Is that what I'm getting from this? Or is it the financial part? Because you mentioned that too.
And the punishment aspect of it, because there are a whole bunch of examples, the most egregious examples in some of the articles that I have in front of me. One is from John Stossel on Reason. He talks about a Boeing executive that was forced out of his position for opposing women's service in the military 30 years ago. There was a Los Angeles soccer team that fired a player because his wife posted a racist comment on Instagram or something. Harry Potter's author J.K. Rowling is being smeared as transphobic because she said that identifying as a woman doesn't make that person a woman. So now she's a transphobe, and that she should basically be canceled, and they shouldn't take any of her book publishers shouldn't publish any of her books, et cetera, et cetera. So those in all of these extreme examples, there's even more. There's there's a lecturer at some college that refused to cancel his test for black students because of BLM, and he got suspended. So I think all of these egregious examples usually only come to light when there's some type of like punishment, or at least like extensive shaming in the public square, like the student that Jim referenced.
Yeah, but anytime anything that's involving, let's not buy this product, or that, those are all punishments in a sense.
Oh,
right?
I agree.
So because you're not buying the product.
Yeah. And, I almost think it starts at a personal level when you decide that you're not going to buy a product or go to a place to get a good or a service based on that person's ideology, right? So I think that, if you're going to discriminate against a product based on the qualities of the product or the price of the product, that's not cancel culture. It's just, that's not the product that suits your needs. But once you start to let the other person's ideology be the determining factor of why you do something, maybe that's the start of cancel culture. I'm not saying that that's exactly what I think, is just an idea that I'm throwing out there.
I just think that it's really easy for us to identify like the extreme cases of it. But with any spectrum like that, it's like it has to have a starting point. So it's like, at what point does it become okay? At what point is it part of the egregious part of that?
So that's why I said that. I don't think that there is a clear line. There is no clear line, because there's a subjective element to it. But that was why I focused in on the media, because I think that's really ultimately what determines it. There is no objective standard for when we're crossing over into, abusive cancel culture. So because there's no objective standard that we can all just look at and say, well, that clearly crossed the line, essentially we rely on we don't necessarily know this, we're subconsciously doing this, but we're subconsciously relying on the media to tell us when something is worth being outraged over. And that's really, I think, the only way to make sense out of all of these different examples of people and cancel culture. It was like, at some point, the media decided this is something worth canceling. And then because of that, brought lots of attention to it. And then that caused that thing to be canceled. In the case of social media, where you've had some instances where you've had people just individual people who have been canceled because, they said something and then got on a flight and then got off the flight. And then all of a sudden the world knew that they were terrible. That's sort of the story that Jim told. I think in that case, that can only happen. That wasn't the media doing that necessarily, but it was influencers. It was powerful people on Twitter who made that decision. So again, it's the same thing. It's like when the powerful people in society decide to cancel something, that's when it gets canceled. But prior to that moment, it doesn't typically happen. I mean, when are these things really truly grassroots, in the sense that everybody just kind of on their own figures out, I don't like this thing. Things are the way they are for a reason. Aunt Jemima was around for all those years for a reason, because people weren't offended by it. Then people came along and said, you should be offended by this. And if you're not, you're a racist. And then people were offended by it. So I think that what the standard is, whatever the media says the standard is, whatever the influential people in society say the standard is, that's it. I don't think there is any other way of defining it.
I think one of the keys here is the way the left has politicized every single aspect of our lives, from sports to food delivery services to everything else. And the cancel culture kicks in when you say something politically incorrect. Now, like Noam Chomsky, for instance, hard leftist. I mean, he empathized with Pol Pot, for crying out loud, back in the 60s. And, he writes books that I don't want to read. It's not cancel culture because I ignore his books and don't want to read them. And thank God I never had to take them back when I was in college. I have to read any of them. But that's not cancel culture. That's just me making a choice. And, he's a political activist and writer. So you're making a choice to withdraw from that political sphere because you're not interested in it. The left has imposed politics into so many aspects of our lives that I'll take my DoorDash versus Grubhub example. With Grubhub, I use Grubhub all the time. It would have been fine. I had no problems with it whatsoever. But the left over years has politicized so many things that he makes a big show and a public show of trashing Trump supporters, to the point where if you've supported Trump, you're not a welcome person in my company. He didn't have to say that. He decided to politicize his own company. So then, yeah, I'm going to make a choice at that point to to use another service. And that's it's, if it wasn't for the politicization of freaking food delivery, that never, I wouldn't have personally canceled him. And that's what's happening now all over the culture. It's like, Justin, pancake syrup used to not be a political argument, or not involved in any kind of political argument whatsoever, or even societal argument. But suddenly it is. And all of these things are being imposed upon us by the left. The right generally does not engage in these things, does not care to engage in these things, and does not, just wants to get along with their lives the way things used to be. They want their sports without political statements in every aspect of it, from what they wear on their backs to what they do before, during the national anthem or before the national anthem. They just want to watch a football game, or they just want to go out to the ballpark. And we're not allowed to do that stuff anymore because the left has politicized everything.
Well, I think that's true in the modern era. I think that's true.
Yeah,
but I think that there probably was a time, actually there was a time, I think, when people who would be considered conservatives today on the sort of conservative, social conservative side of the spectrum would have absolutely done that and did do that and did that for many years. I mean, and so I think that has happened on both sides of the spectrum, historically speaking. Today, though, conservatives don't control any institutions. Exactly. So it's not even, it doesn't even matter. I mean, what if I wanted to cancel a product? Like, the only thing I could do is maybe if I could somehow get on, Fox News or something every day, I could convince conservatives to stop buying a product, but I could never convince people other than conservatives to stop buying it. So because we don't control any institutions, we don't even really have the opportunity to do it to anybody. But when we did control institutions, because there was a time when more conservative people did control institutions, I think they did do this, to different degrees and about different issues and topics. And so I think this is more of a human thing than it is like a left-right thing per se. Although I think ultimately you could argue that the conservatives who did it back when they did it were also kind of engaging in liberalism, in the sense that they were trying to use the collective to silence opposition. And that's really not a, far right way of handling anything, So you could make the case that they weren't really being conservative in those situations, even though they were ideologically conservative generally.
So are you suggesting that the only reason that we're talking about this is because our side is losing at this ongoing battle? Or could you make the case, I think I would make the case, that this cancel culture concept has been supercharged by the role of social media and media in general?
Yeah, I think that media in general has supercharged it without question. And I think that I would argue that, because I think social media has done that clearly, but I would argue that the 24-hour news cycle was probably even worse for it, at least initially. There's only so much you can talk about when the news is on for an hour a night, or 2 hours a night or something. But when you have a 24-hour news cycle and you have to have content on all the time on multiple channels constantly, you're more likely to find things to get people outraged about, probably, because you're more likely to get viewers if you can get people angry. So I think there's a degree of that too.
Fox News was talking about how they didn't like how Michelle Obama would dress. That's stupid. The right does this too. And I think that we need to be totally willing to call that out.
Well, I think that the social media aspect of it, because even if the media was relatively talking about it, the real hostile takes come from people with 75, followers on Twitter. They have to make a name for themselves. So they come out with the most extreme. Followers. Yeah, they come out with the most extreme take on something. And, try to dox somebody because they said a joke that they didn't like. So I would argue that social media actually plays a much larger role in all of this than you're giving it credit for.
I don't know about that, because I think that ultimately, you can have, if you have 75 followers, ultimately it's whatever, you can do whatever you want. It's not going to have an impact unless more influential people are backing it. I mean, again, how do we explain? Because at some point, somebody said, it may have been Jim, I don't know. Somebody said something to the effect of, look, The left, they find something that, you may have said 30 years ago, and then, then they go after you, right? But the truth is, there's all sorts of people that have said all kinds of terrible things that the left knows about. People who are on the left, people who are not on the left, and they haven't done anything about them. So they're not, it's not as though they just are any evidence they find, they go after that person every single time. That's not true. Sometimes they wait 10 years and then they go after somebody. Sometimes they don't ever go after someone, and it's almost inexplicable why they haven't. I mean, it's not consistent, which is why I said I don't even think that they have a standard. I think that they use it as a tool to bludgeon the people they want to bludgeon whenever they feel like it's advantageous for them to do that. That's why Bill Clinton, got away with, all of the stuff that he got away with the way he treated Monica Lewinsky and all these other people. And then Brett Kavanaugh, someone just comes out and says something, makes an accusation about something that happened decades ago with no evidence at all other than just her personal story. And then that person, we should destroy that guy's whole career. But Bill Clinton, he could be president for 2 terms. That was fine. So it's like they just pick and choose what is acceptable and what isn't. Harvey Weinstein's another example. A lot of people on the left knew all about Harvey Weinstein. They didn't say anything. Right? Roman Polanski. There's all kinds of people on the left who have gotten a pass, even though they know it. So why aren't they canceling all of those people? Why hasn't Bill Clinton been canceled? So it's not just whenever it really is whenever they feel like it. Not so much they have some high standard and they're going to hold people to it every single time. That's not even true. That's what I think is so scary about it, is people don't even really know what it is. There's no escape. If they really want to destroy you, they can, and they will. It's just a matter of when they feel like destroying you.
Yeah, but one of the differences, Justin, is that some people deserve to be destroyed, and most people that are being destroyed by cancel culture don't. I mean, Harvey Weinstein was convicted of crimes, right? And there was a story that Rowan Farrow was working on for many months, brought it to NBC News, and they spiked it. They said, no, we're not doing anything on that. So then he had to go to the New Yorker and wins a Pulitzer Prize for it. So if it wasn't for that, if it wasn't for that story getting out and the fact that Harvey Weinstein, there were people that were accused that were going to the police, then he would have continued to get away with it like he did for 30 years. And so that's one of the differences here. But there are people that just say something that the left doesn't like and have their entire lives ruined. And, maybe, it happened on the right. It happened maybe with the moral majority in the 80s and all of that stuff. But one of the differences is that not all conservatives thought that was a good idea. Howard Stern would not have risen, who said all sorts of very offensive things back in the 80s and 90s on the radio that he would never actually say today, even on satellite radio. There were a lot of people on the right that loved Howard Stern. I was one of them. I was a very early listener of his program and listened to it for many years because I think in general, people on the right value free speech more. They think it's okay if you're offended. There was a guy on Twitter who just got, actually a guy on YouTube and Twitter. He just had his 2 accounts suspended. I actually don't even want to say his name, because if I state his name on this podcast on YouTube, we'll probably get this video shadow banned in some way. But let's just say his initials are SM, and you can do your own research on that. But he was removed from these 2 platforms because the left doesn't like what he says. Now, I haven't watched all of his videos. I didn't read all of his tweets all the time. And he would say things that were, to a lot of people today, very kind of uncomfortable. Even me, I thought, well, that's a weird thing to say. I don't necessarily agree with that, but I'm going to listen to all the other things he says because he has a prolific amount of content, and nobody should just be judged on 1 or 2 things, or even 1 or 2 things they think, let alone 1 or 2 things that they say. But that's the place we are right now. But people on the right are generally more open to ideas. It's okay if they are offended. They will move on with life. The tweet I read from Philippa Sue, her idea is, no, I will not move on with life if I am offended. And in fact, I will not let you move on with your life if you offended me. It's this mentality. It's that mindset that is really behind cancel culture. And I know that both, the idea that both sides do it is something very convenient and easy to say, but it simply isn't the case. The vast majority of this stuff, of the suppression of free speech in this country, is coming from the left. The right values free speech. The left does not, period.
Yeah, I mean, the depersoning and deplatforming is definitely another kind of one of those aspects of like the punishments and the reprimands that I was talking about earlier. But what you said there about how the left generally is okay with this is a nice little segue into this kind of part of the conversation, where there was a letter that was published by Harper's Magazine, is titled "A Letter on Justice and Open Debate." This was just published this week, I believe on Tuesday. And it is co-signed by 150 different people that are mostly on the left side of the column. Margaret Atwood, the author, Noam Chomsky signed it, J.K. Rowling, a number of professors from universities, including Stanford, Harvard, Dartmouth, Rutgers, Columbia, Princeton, etc., etc. They all signed on to this, and it's a pretty short letter, so I'm just going to read through it here. It says, "Our cultural institutions are facing a moment of trial. Powerful protests and for racial and social justice are leading to overdue demands for police reform, along with wider calls for greater equality and inclusion across our society, not least in higher education, journalism, philanthropy, and the arts. But this needed a reckoning has also intensified a new set of moral attitudes and political commitments that tend to weaken our norms of open debate and toleration of differences in favor of ideological conformity. As we applaud the first development, we also raise our voices against the second. The forces of illiberalism are gaining strength throughout the world and have a powerful ally in Donald Trump, who represents a real threat to democracy. But resistance must not be allowed to harden into its own brand of dogma or coercion, with right-wing demagogues are already exploiting. The democratic institutions we want can be achieved only if we speak out against the intolerant climate that has set in on all sides." So again, this is kind of more of like a thing for liberals to sign on to. So of course it has to start off with "We hate Donald Trump" monologue there. But it gets into some stuff that I think we can all agree on here. It says, "The free exchange of information and ideas, the lifeblood of a liberal society, is daily becoming more constricted. While we have come to expect this on the radical right, censoriousness is also spreading more widely in our culture. An intolerance of opposing views, a vogue for public shaming and ostracism, and the tendency to dissolve complex policy issues in a blinding moral certainty. We uphold the value of robust and even caustic counter speech from all quarters, but it is not all too common to hear calls for swift and severe retribution in response to perceived transgressions of speech and thought. More troubling still, institutional leaders, in a spirit of panicked damage control, are delivering hasty and disproportionate punishments instead of considered reforms. Editors are fired for running controversial pieces. Books are withdrawn for alleged inauthenticity. Journalists are barred from writing on certain topics. Professors are investigated for quoting works of literature in class. A researcher is fired for circulating a peer-reviewed academic study. And the heads of organizations are ousted for what are sometimes just clumsy mistakes. Whatever the arguments around each particular incident, the result has been to steadily narrow the boundaries of what can be said without the threat of reprisal. We are already paying the price in greater risk aversion among writers, artists, and journalists who fear for their livelihoods as they depart from the consensus or even lack sufficient zeal in agreement. This stifling atmosphere will ultimately harm the most vital causes of our time. The restriction of debate, whether by a regressive government or an intolerant society, invariably hurts those who lack power and make everyone less capable of democratic participation. The way to defeat bad ideas is by exposure, argument, and persuasion, not by trying to silence or wish them away. We refuse any false choice between justice and freedom, which cannot exist without each other. As writers, we need a culture that leaves us room for experimentation, risk-taking, or even mistakes. We need to preserve the possibility of good faith disagreement without dire professional consequences. If we won't defend the very thing on which our work depends, we shouldn't expect the public or the state to defend it for us. So again, that's signed by 150 different scholars and artists and writers and professionals. But Of course, with the exception of the throat clearing, with trying to, talk about how Trump is like one of the biggest threats to all of this, I think we can mostly agree on all of that, correct?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, that's like John Stuart Mill type stuff to Trump Justin and his 1800s reference. Bam. But there's a really good book about this called Kindly Inquisitors by Jonathan Rauch. And basically his whole thesis of the book is if you do not allow people to express their opposing views verbally without some kind of repercussion like this, you're basically leaving them no opportunity to get these feelings out except for violence. And one of the interesting things, I just want to read a quick quote from that book, because I think that it's super important. A liberal society stands on the proposition that we should all take seriously the idea that we may be wrong. This means we must place in no one, including ourselves, beyond the reach of criticism. It means that we must allow people to err, even where the error offends and upsets, as it often will. So like, there's no humility left. There's no wiggle room for anybody. Everybody's just trying to squeeze every single inch, because it's the whole like, well, if we give an inch, then they'll take a mile thing. But that also doesn't allow people to like move at all. So you just end up doubling down on bad positions, or you just try to cancel people and ruin their lives.
Yeah, I must say that this letter would be more powerful if a number of these didn't walk back them signing it because of cancel culture type.
Sure.
So there's an example of that. This is another Reason article. It says the reaction to the Harper's letter on cancel culture proves why it was so necessary. So one of the signers of this was a Vox contributor. That's VOX contributor, and signed on to it. That's all he did. Sign on to it. And then a colleague of his by the name of Emily Vanderveff, she wrote on Twitter, she says, I sent a version of this to the editors at Vox. I have redacted some bits as they're internal to Vox, blah, 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 blah. But it basically goes through, and it's her explanation about how she was offended by this letter, how it's full of anti-trans dog whistles, and how she feels less safe being at work at Vox because her colleague signed on to it. She says at the end that I don't want Matt, the guy that signed on to it, to be reprimanded or even fired, or even asked to submit an apology. She just wants to make her, point that she feels offended by all of this and less safe at work. And it's just like, so putting it on Twitter is the best way to air your concern with his letter? Like, you don't want him reprimanded, so you're going to send a letter to your boss and all over Twitter? It just seems ridiculous. So he basically apologized for signing it. There's a couple of stories like that. So I don't know. I mean, Jim, is it a good sign that there's letters like this being circulated on the left, or a little too little too late? I don't know. What?
It's better than not having the letter out there. I'll say that. And you're right that it's discouraging that with the very smallest of pushback from the left, these lefties, for the most part, some of them are starting to back away from it. As you were reading that letter, though, and I'd read it earlier today, and it sparked that memory again. Who are the ones that all the things that they are advancing, or what they would like to happen here? All of the publications should be allowed. Should allow more diversity of views. Famously, the editor of the New York Times opinion page got fired for running an op-ed by Senator Tom Cotton, taking a position that 58% of the American people agreed with. So running a majoritarian opinion in the largest newspaper in the United States was a firing offense. This just happened. But who controls all these institutions that these letter writers, the signatories to this letter, would like to see opened up and be more liberal in the classic liberal sense, to be more open to more ideas? The left controls all of these organizations. The left controls all of these levers of power. And so it's nice that they're talking to themselves. And it's unfortunate that, maybe they're not listening. And even some of the people who signed the letter want to step back from it because they're afraid of the mob coming for them. This is better than these things not happening. And it's good but there needs to be more self-examination on the left that controls, the powerful organs of media in this country, the powerful organs of social media in this country, to embrace once again, the classic liberal idea of free speech, and that the answer to speech you don't like is not canceling, it's not suppressing, it is not censoring, but the answer is more speech. If you want to persuade people, you have to use logic and reason. If you want to change somebody's heart, you have to use moral persuasion. You don't get to, you can't accomplish either of those goals by telling people to shut up.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. And that kind of leads into my next question, which is like, how do we combat against this, right? Because I think that like the knee jerk for people on our side of the aisle is, let's fight fire with fire. If they're going to cancel somebody over here, then we're going to cancel somebody over there. There was a video that was kind of going viral-ish of I believe she was actually ended up only being an intern of a company where she made a joke, which was essentially a joke about stabbing people and that said that all lives mattered. It was a joke, right?
Oh yeah.
And she gets
that
fired.
Girl who died.
Yeah, right. So obviously Isaac's got a response very, very similar to I think a lot of people on our side of the aisle that would find that funny, because again, it's like these are the systems that you've created, and now it's burning some of your own. People like, was it Jimmy Kimmel? Or one of the late night show guys that like dug up some stuff from his past. Now it looks like he's going to be taking a break from his show. It's like, do we defend these people against the system that we think is bad? Or do we say like, hey, you guys created it. That's your bed. Lie in it. Or both.
Yeah. So on a like unhelpful personal standpoint, I'm going to laugh. But I think as a country, we need to be more willing to like forgive people, right? Like, I don't think that girl should have her whole life ruined. Like,
sure.
I just think that's too far. I don't think Jimmy Kimmel should have. I don't know. What do you think? Do you think it should have been canceled?
Well, I don't know. I mean, if we take the high road, I'm not talking about specific cases. I'm talking about this in general. But if we take the high road, are we going to be just isolated on the high road? Or do you think we're honestly going to be able to drag some people along there with us?
See, I don't think other people will try to like get at you for like doing what you think is taking the high road, right? Like if you say, well, I don't think Jimmy Kimmel should have been canceled because like that was a long time ago, things were different back then, the circumstances, everybody's just going to look at you and say, you need to be canceled too. So, but that's it, right? Like
you Kimmel enabler.
That's it, right? Because like if you're not, it's like all or nothing now. And I just feel that there's no room for growth there. Like Jimmy Kimmel came out and said, look, I don't agree with what I did in the past. It's been something that I haven't really, I've been like kind of ashamed of, and I've grown since then. And they're still like, nope, see you later, buddy.
Right. Justin, I think we had a conversation about this, but it was probably like a week or two ago. You kind of feel the same way, or have you changed?
Yeah, I what makes this so complicated is that on the one hand, I would like to say, well, we should be for, free speech, and we should stand up and say, well, it's wrong to go after even people on the left. And, I get that, and I sympathize with that view. And I think personally, that's how I feel. On the other hand, part of the problem that we have is that, and this is really why we have Donald Trump as president, by the way, is that for a long time, conservatives tried to, I think, take the high road when it came to a lot of these different issues. And then they got beat over the head over and over and over again for decades. Just eaten alive. And what we realized at some point, a lot of people on the right, is that you can be a Boy Scout. You could be Mitt Romney, okay? Who's a Boy Scout.
Say that.
Nicest guy in the world, basically.
He put his dog on the his car. So.
Right. He was a Mormon pastor, essentially, with 1 million kids, doesn't drink, doesn't smoke, doesn't even drink coffee. He's like the nicest guy in the world, right? And yet they turned him into a monster. And at some point, John McCain is a war hero, turned him into a monster.
Oh, man, don't even get me started.
Everyone on the right, if you're on the right, if you oppose the left, you're a monster. They'll find a reason to make you a monster. And so then part of me thinks, well, if we're constantly defending the people who are trying to destroy us, then how does that help us? Don't we end up getting destroyed by this? Because they're not going to return the favor. So it's like, if we save Jimmy Kimmel, are they going to save one of ours? No, of course not. So it's not fair. It's not a fair situation at all. Ultimately, though, I think the conversation we're having is really not focused on the right area anyway, because there's nothing we can do after the fact. We're way downstream at this point. When you're talking about getting rid of Jimmy Kimmel, we're too far downstream. Nothing we do is going to help us at that point. How we treat Jimmy Kimmel is not going to matter. It has no impact whatsoever on the future of how people look at conservatism or whatever. This all comes from way earlier on. It comes from the school system. That's where it comes from. That's what's shaping the culture. Schools, Hollywood, media, that shapes the culture. That shapes what's acceptable and what's not acceptable. That creates the conditions that allows for this sort of thing to happen. And so you have to change those things first before you can worry about this other stuff. Because ultimately we can save Jimmy Kimmel today, and then Hollywood and the media and academia a week from now decides to destroy one of our people for something less than what Jimmy Kimmel did. And it doesn't matter. Hypocrisy is totally lost on the left. It makes absolutely, they're giant hypocrites. They're hypocrites all the time. It doesn't matter. So you have to change those core foundational structures to have any hope in the long run of changing people's perceptions on this particular issue. If the schools are saying it's okay to cancel people, and Hollywood saying it's okay to cancel people, and news outlets are saying it's okay to cancel people, then nothing conservatives do after the fact is going to change anything. You have to change those institutions. That's the only hope we have of saving America. And conservatives have neglected that, frankly, for a very, very, very long time. And if conservatives 30 years ago had said, the most important thing in the world is school choice and getting our kids out of schools that are run by leftists, the country today would be way, way different than it is right now. But they didn't. Instead, they chose to fight over all these other battles, some of them important, some of them not. And as a result, we have the world that we're living in right now. That has to change. It absolutely has to change.
I almost thought that, maybe this is giving our side of too much credit, but I almost thought us playing into it was kind of like an overexposure attempt. It's like, well, if you want to do this far, then you also have to include these people, and then Jimmy Kimmel, and then their response was, well, yeah, okay, yeah. No, we didn't actually mean that. We're just trying to point out how ridiculous, your thing is here.
Right, and I think that used to work a little bit. But I think now it doesn't work. It doesn't matter because they have no problem with there are people on the left, not everybody, but there are people on the left, the really hardcore people who would love to see the whole thing burn to the ground. They would love it.
Sure.
So if Woodrow Wilson and Jimmy Kimmel have to be victims for them to build their socialist utopia, so be it. They're fine with it. And so I actually think we're at a point where you can't even point out the hypocrisy. They don't care about hypocrisy. You can't point out the fact that it's not equal and not fair. And are you going to hold your own people accountable? Doesn't matter. Yeah, sure. We'll ban anybody who you want us to ban. Who do you want us to ban this week? It doesn't matter anymore. Because at the end, they know that if they continue going down this road, they'll get what they want. So yes, get rid of Jimmy Kimmel, get rid of Woodrow Wilson, get rid of FDR, get rid of all of them, get rid of everybody. Who cares? In the end, we'll get what we want. So we can't, I don't know that helps us either. We have to, like I said, the only solution is to change the core structures. That's the only way. The foundation, education, media, Hollywood, that's the only way. If we don't have our own, institutions that we can rely on, so our kids are not being indoctrinated by all of those institutions, if we can have that, then we have a chance. If we don't have that, then just give it enough time and they will eventually win out.
All right. Well, audience, I do, this is obviously more of just an open discussion that we were having here. So I do want to hear from you. What is the line at which it becomes cancel culture? Help us define the term. Send it all in. Email us at inthetankpodcast@gmail.com. I really want to hear from you. If we get some good ones, maybe we'll read them off next week. Jim or Isaac, do you want to have a last?
We'll read them off too, and we'll say your name on air.
That's right. Any last words on this subject before we sign off for the week?
All right. So this is a question for Justin.
Make it quick. We've got no time left. So.
Okay, fine. But is it possible that at some point the cancel culture just alienates enough people who are like reasonable, good people to where they're just sick of it?
Yes.
I mean, but that's like it, right? Or is it the school choice is the only way that this is going to work? And like,
so
if enough people are kicked off of Twitter, they'll start Parler. If enough people are kicked out of Hollywood, they'll start conservative Hollywood. If enough people are kicked out of whatever academic things, we'll create our own. It'll happen eventually.
So I think that if maybe, but I think that the problem that we have is that the media, I don't think will ever allow that to really happen. At some point, they'll just destroy Parler. They'll just say Parler is for Nazis, and then that's it. The only people who will be left on Parler are the people who don't care or who know that it's not really like that. But all of the middle ground, all of the people who are in the middle, the people who, Parler would want to win over, who are not necessarily conservatives or just regular people, they'll be turned off by it. See, the media will destroy any attempt you have to try to do any of the things you're talking about. They have too much control over the information between the social media companies and Google and Hollywood and the media and schools. They decide what is true and what isn't true. They decide it, not you, not regular people. They decide it. There are people who can ignore that, who can see through it, who can look beyond it. Yes. And a lot of those people tend to be conservative. And there are some liberal people who do it too. But the vast majority of people do not have time or don't care or don't have the aptitude to go and figure it out. And so they just believe whatever the media tells them. And that's ultimately the problem that we have.
All right, Jim, he used up all of your time to say any last words. Unless it's super important. I'll give you an extra 10 seconds here.
Cancel culture will not stop until the people implementing cancel culture feel the effects of their own program. They've been feeding conservatives to the crocodile for years. They're not going to. The only way it's going to stop is if some of them get fed to the crocodile too, because they're not going to do it on their own for the goodness of free speech and out of the goodness of their hearts.
Audience, thank you for joining us for this episode of the In the Think podcast. If you like our show, please subscribe, write a review for us on iTunes. It'd be greatly appreciated. You can also find us on Stitcher, Google Play, SoundCloud, Stitcher again, iTunes, Stitcher, Google Play, and YouTube, of course. If you'd like, you can follow us on Twitter. Don't really do it. In the Tank Pod. If you would like to send us your comments, questions, concerns, feel free to email us at inthethankpodcast@gmail.com. Isaac, where can the people find you?
Parler at the fracking guy.
Nice. Justin Haskins, same question.
Still on socialist Twitter at Justin T. Haskins.
And Jim Lakely, where can the people find you?
At J Lakely on Twitter, at Heartland Inst on Twitter, and heartland.org.
Thank you all for tuning in. We will talk to you
on Twitter
next week.